All right, so to review one more time, and probably at this point you're getting tired of hearing about this, about the fact that the Puritans were scared of the woods and whatever was in them. But let's summarize that one more time. So to the Puritans, Native Americans were red devils, and nature and wilderness are inherently evil because they are wild. They are untamed, they are chaotic, therefore they are ungodly and not to be trusted, nor are people who spend too much time in the woods to be trusted. And, of course, Native Americans spent all the time in the woods, so can't trust them at all. In fact, they were regarded as not only savages and red devils, but as evil tempters who would come slinking around your town and try to convince colonists to go away to the woods with them and live their free and abandoned lifestyle, which the Puritan authorities were very, very much against. In 1642, for example, a law was passed against colonists living among the Indians, and if you did that and you were caught, you would be sentenced to 3 years of hard labor. Also, the Puritans encouraged the publication of captivity narratives. We'll get to that in a moment, but before we talk about what captivity narratives are, I just want to direct you, if you're a movie person like I am, to this movie from 2015, The Witch, and the subtitle of it was A New England Folktale. So this movie is a really, really good example of the types of fears of the unknown, of the forest and the wilderness that Puritans of that era had. All right, well, captivity narratives were the memoirs of people who had been captured by Indians, almost always in New England, who had been captured by Indians and lived briefly among them and managed to make their way back home one way or another and can now tell their story. These were printed in London because there were no large printing presses in New England. Eventually there were in Boston, but when these things were coming out, starting in the 1670s and really picking up in the 1680s and 90s, they were published in London. One really good example of this type of narrative, this type of literature, is a book called The Sovereignty and Goodness of God. The subtitle of that being The Narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. So that was first published in 1682. Mary Rowlandson was a survivor of an attack by the Wampanoag, who came through and destroyed most of her town during King Philip's War. And some of her children were killed and some survived. Her husband was away at the time. So she and some of her children were taken captive and lived among the Indians until they were traded back to the colonists in kind of a prisoner exchange. So her description of what her everyday life was like was a perfect description of kinship slavery, which we talked about some time ago, which is the form of captivity practiced by Native Americans, where you capture someone from your opponent's side, and you decide not to kill them, and you decide not to adopt them into your tribe immediately, but instead you make them sort of captive laborers. And so that's what happened to her. She was assigned to a specific family that she lived with and was basically helping with the chores. And she didn't understand. She didn't know about these cultural practices. So to her mind, she was being held captive by these diabolical devil worshippers, who every once in a while would be nice to her. And instead of being aware of how kinship slavery works, how gradually you can be accepted into the household and then eventually adopted as a full member of the tribe, instead she just assumed that God, the Spirit of God, was entering their devil-worshipping hearts and forcing them to be nice to her because she was a servant of God. And that's really how almost all these captivity narratives went. They sort of followed the same arc. And in reality, in most cases, the person who was the subject of the narrative didn't write it. They provided the basic details, and it was written by the editors of the book, who are very much Puritan. So that Mary Rowlandson and other people who wrote these narratives, the way they saw the world was that the Puritans in their communities in New England weren't worshiping God well enough, and so God punished them by sending these diabolical agents of Satan to kill and torture them, and then God forgave them after they showed repentance and miraculously caused their captors to be kind to them every now and then, and eventually let them go if they wanted to. So everything hinged not on the culture of the different groups involved, not on the politics of the region, but everything resolved on that Puritan and their individual relationship with God, and that's the framework through which they saw everything. A lot of times those captivity narratives would be very sensationalized. There was a lot of emphasis on tales of women being ravished or ravaged or raped. Not usually described in explicit detail, but alluded to enough that it could be titillating. Now, no self-respecting Puritan was going to go into a bookstore and buy a book that has sex and violence in it, unless it's a book about how wonderful God is, and there happens to just happens to be sex and violence, and then that's okay, so they'll buy it, right? In reality, I said that there's a lot of emphasis on those things, and they were really exaggerated, even if they weren't given in detail, because so far as I'm aware, I don't think there is one documented case of a white female colonist being raped in an attack by Native Americans in that time period anywhere east of the Mississippi. That's the Woodland Indians, north or south. And that is due to a unique cultural trait of those tribes, which tribes west of the Mississippi didn't necessarily have. So if you look at captivity narratives written in the 1800s by or about American women, white American women who were captured by Plains Indians like the Sioux or the Comanche, and they have these very graphic, detailed accounts of rape and torture of women. That's true. The reason is that in the eastern tribes, there was this very important need for ceremonial cleanness when you're on the warpath. So all these warriors, once they were ready to go to war, went through these rituals to prepare them. And part of the purification ritual was they were to abstain from sexual relations until the war party was back and everything was over and they were back into their civilian mode. So it would be very unlikely for something like that to happen east of the Mississippi to white women. Now, there are plenty of documented cases of white colonists raping Native American women. Anyway, this is just an example of some of the exaggerations that were there in these captivity narratives, and in itself, those exaggerations demonstrate a much broader thing: the fact that European, and that includes people living in Europe and European colonists and their descendants, Europeans' views of Native Americans were kind of this bizarre split, a dichotomy. They looked at them in one of two ways: either as red devils, heathen savages sent by Satan, or noble savages. So they were either demonized or they were romanticized. Rarely were they regarded or described as human, as normal human beings who kind of run the gamut of different characteristics, right? So it was either all one thing or all the other. And this is my statement here in italics. Whether Native Americans were demonized or romanticized by white people totally depended on proximity in space and time. What does that mean? Well, first of all, space. You look at the 1600s, the mid to late 1600s, and you've got these captivity narratives and other things being written by colonists on the frontier, and almost universally they are very anti-Indian. They are very prejudiced, I guess you could say, and they really describe the Indians in this all evil cast. Whereas if you were reading literature, including poetry and plays that were being written in Europe, the opposite was true. Indians were usually portrayed as noble savages, that is, not evil, but rather as sort of living in the innocence of quote-unquote primitive man, like unto Adam and Eve in the garden, in that they had not been tainted by civilization, and so their ways were wiser than the ways of Europeans. And in many ways, if you think about it, those two wildly differing views remain into the 20th and now into the 21st century. So that's proximity in space. If you were European in the 1600s, 17, even 1800s if you were white, and you lived really close to Indians and were therefore competing with them for resources, odds are you would have a very negative and violent attitude toward them. Whereas, if you were only viewing them from a great distance and were not competing with them for resources and not feeling threatened by their existence, then it was more likely that you would romanticize them. Now, what about the time part? Well, here's a good example of that. Now, later on, we're going to be talking about the Trail of Tears. So that's a couple hundred years after where we are now, but you're probably aware of it, where Indians, particularly in the South, Cherokees and other southern tribes, were decried as vicious savages incapable of civilization by their white neighbors who wanted their land, despite the fact that many of those Indians had now adapted to the European way of doing things, and some of them spoke better and dressed better English, spoke better English, dressed better, and were wealthier than their white neighbors. Clearly they were, quote, civilized, but they were not recognized as such, and they were chased away at gunpoint from their homes. Once most of them were gone, all of a sudden, in the South, people spoke fondly of them, of the romantic figures of the great Cherokee leaders and Choctaw leaders of times of old. All of a sudden, everybody had a Cherokee grandmother that they'd never talked about before. During the process, though, when they were trying to force the Indians to move west of the Mississippi, most white Southerners supported that. Most white Northerners, especially in New England, were opposed to it because they thought it was cruel and un-American. And the response of the white Southerners to the New Englanders was, that's easy for you to say, where are your Indians? Well, they were mostly gone, right? Same thing had happened in New England. They were regarded as vicious until there were hardly any of them left. And then all of a sudden, there's something to be admired and romanticized. Same thing happens after the Trail of Tears. Late 1800s, white people in the American West, wrote vicious things about their Native American neighbors, and people in the South were sympathetic to them because they were gone. And it all does come down to, I believe, competition. Once someone is removed as your competitor for whatever it is you're trying to get, then sort of in sort of posthumously, then you can regard how wonderful that they were. In fact, all right, if you're trying to take away someone's land that anybody that was looking at this objectively would recognize they were there first, it is their land. If you're trying to take it away, you do not want to describe those people from whom you're taking the land as this really great, wonderful group of folks, because that makes you look really bad. Instead, you describe them as an other. You describe them as vicious, savage, incapable of reform, and therefore you're justified in taking away their land. Once that happens, and you've got the land, and they're gone, then you can sit back and retroactively talk about how great they were. Because if they were great, noble and honorable, and yet still doomed to fall before the progress of the superior white people, that makes you look good now in retrospect. So that's all very complicated, and I don't think that anyone sat down and planned that out. But it's kind of how things unspooled. Now, if you'll recall, when we discussed the English colonists' war with the Powhatan Confederacy led by Opechancanough back in 1620s into the 1630s, I said that the kind of the harsh conditions of that war, the fact that so many colonists were killed, and yet they ultimately triumphed, kind of led to a community spirit, kind of an esprit de corps among those Virginia colonists that made them feel like they were unique among all English colonists because they had survived something that other English colonists had not. Well, half a century later, in King Philip's War up in New England, those colonists sort of reacted the same way. So those wars, very, very brutal wars against Indians in the 17th century when there weren't a whole lot of white people. Therefore, it was not possible to overwhelm the opponent with numbers. Those wars helped develop that sense of identity, of colonial identity that set them apart from the people living back in England and even people living in other English colonies around the world. And this is what gradually grew into a sense of American identity. And a lot of historians have argued, including myself, that the development of that colonial American identity was sort of the template for the American identity. And since we're talking about English colonists, then we're initially talking about this identity being one of whiteness. And that colonial American identity was found by triangulating between two other points of reference, by comparing themselves against two other groups of people, which is how it's how communities develop. You figure out who you are by figuring out who you're not. So in the case of the colonists, the English colonists in the 1600s, the two groups they could compare themselves to were Native Americans and the African slaves whom they had begun importing beginning in 1619. So what does it mean to be free and an American colonist? Well, it means you're not one of those other two things. You're not a slave and you're not an Indian. Now, this very simple chart I have up here very simple chart of my own very simple making. Kind of lays out how to triangulate and find that point on the racial structure that was developing that is the point of power. You define against these other two groups. So the point, what I call the refining point, which is Native Americans, they're in red. That is something that is movable, mutable. Something that kind of goes up and down depending on the circumstances. And we just finished talking about that. Views toward Native Americans fluctuated between these two extremes of romanticizing them or demonizing them, depending on where they were, depending on the circumstances. Okay? And as I said, a lot of that has to do with competition for resources. If you were fighting someone for land, and you're fighting them right now, they're low-down, dirty dogs. But if you take the land away from them, then afterward, retroactively, if you can say, wow, they were noble, valiant foes, and we were blessed in being able to conquer and defeat them, but of course they were doomed to fail because we're superior. Why, that makes you look even better, okay? And you can't do that. You can't do that with a group that you are enslaving, such as the African group. And by this point, as we will discuss soon, by 1700, that slave situation became exclusively an African one. So if you were actually like kidnapping people and forcing them to do labor for you, you cannot retroactively talk about how great they were, because there's no way to make yourself look good if that's the case. You have to describe them as being inherently bad, negative, all negative attributes, unable to take care of themselves, and needing to be controlled. So that's the defining point. That's the point that doesn't move. And you'll see as we go along this course and we talk our way through American history, that point of blackness is always a negative one in American culture. There's the one drop rule later on, that if you have, it doesn't matter if you were 132nd African descent in the 1800s, that made you black and made you subject to slavery, because any black at all tainted the purity. Whereas, as I kind of alluded to a moment ago, once Indians reached a point where they were romanticized, why having a Cherokee grandmother is just something everybody wants to do. You don't hear too many white people, then or now, talking about their African slave grandmother, which is actually, especially in the South, more likely a case. So anyway, I could go on about this for an entire semester or over the course of an entire dissertation, and I've done both. But just keep this in mind and think about it. All right? I believe that the more you think about it, especially as we talk about things moving forward, the more sense it's going to make to you. All right, well, I believe that in addition to the fact that by the year 1700 there was a unique colonial American identity, I believe by 1700 there were two subsets of that identity, a northern one and a southern one, that branched off from those initial two colonies, the first one in Virginia, the second one in Massachusetts. Now we're going to look in a moment at the other colonies that develop over the course of the 1600s. But from the very beginning, these two colonies, although they were similar in many ways, were different in many ways as well. Now remember, the Virginia colony was all about investors wanting to make money, and the people who arrived there, the people who had the money to get the land, were more well-to-do people. In fact, if you've heard this story before about the starving times in Jamestown when Captain John Smith had to put his boot down, due to the fact that times were very, very difficult, and yet a large portion of the English colonists refused to work because that's what they brought servants for. And those servants, of course, were white indentured servants. So, we're gentlemen. We're not here to work. And he had to kind of force them to do so. So they're there trying to turn a profit, and eventually they figure out tobacco is the way to go to do that. The other colony that was chartered also was chartered to make a profit, but the people who wound up running it were Puritans, and those Pilgrims got part of that charter there along the south part there in Plymouth. And even though they also were trying to make a profit, and their profit was more in the timber industry actually at that point, their main reason for being there was religious, if you will recall. So two very different approaches, two different kinds of English people from different parts of England also. So they set these colonies up, and these are the borders of the colonies. And if you will notice, these borders keep going westward off the page. And that's because these early colonists, when they got this charter, the understanding was it starts there on the coast where it has to start because there's Atlantic Ocean beyond that. It starts on the coast and goes westward all the way to the other coast, all the way to the other ocean, theoretically. And you can see where there's this one area there, the Great Lakes area, that Virginia and New England kind of both claimed, both kind of argued over. As other colonies develop, that's going to continue to be the case. That is, that they're going to believe their westward boundaries just keep going. Now, in a more practical way, they have to acknowledge that their western boundaries can only keep going as far west as the Appalachian mountain chain, because beyond that, the French are in control, along with their many, many Native American allies. But in their minds, these folks were thinking, as far west as you can trace from this line of our first establishment, that's what we own. But anyway, to get back to the distinct and very different cultural personalities that develop for these two regions. Now, like I said, they were different types of people that settled in Virginia and that settled in Massachusetts. In addition to the religion thing, well, not in addition, it's actually kind of all wrapped up together, isn't it? Remember what we said earlier about the English Civil War that occurred throughout the 1640s and led to the Puritans in England chopping the king's head off and putting one of their people in charge. Remember, the two different sides were referred to by the nicknames the Cavaliers, meaning the nobility, the people who supported the king, and the Roundheads, who tended to be Puritans and who tended to be very simple. A lot of them were commoners, and in fact, they cut their hair short, which made them look weird to the nobility and to the elite. Well, who settled these two colonies? The Puritans settled the colony to the north. They were Roundheads. The people who were in charge of establishing the Jamestown and the Virginia colony were people who were well-to-do and closely connected to the king. They were Cavaliers. So, in some ways, kind of the framework for the English Civil War was carried over to the American colonies and would help lay the foundation for the American Civil War 200 years later, although slavery is going to be the main factor in that one. Slavery was not a factor at all in the English Civil War. But here you've got diametrically opposed philosophies of life between the people in charge and the people moving into these two different colonies in these two different regions. Now, as a result of that, there's going to be a fundamental cultural difference in how people sort of regard their own identities. And essentially that comes down to, and this has been written about by several prominent historians, the idea of Southern honor, that the Southern colonies were honor-based systems. They basically carried over the social hierarchy from England. That's why it's going to be a lot harder to move up the ladder in the South. If you're born poor, it's going to be a lot harder to move up to middle class or wealthy in the South than it is in the North, because just like in England, those classes, that class system is pretty well frozen in place from the very beginning. Now, what does it mean, honor-based? Does that mean that New Englanders have no honor? Well, what that means is that the New England culture is more of a dignity-based culture. So what the heck is the difference? What's the difference between honor and dignity? Well, dignity is something internal. Dignity is what is inside you. And it is also something that pertains to your relationship with your God. And that's how things were with the Puritans. They were very individualistic in a lot of ways. They believed that there should be no priesthood nor saints. You didn't need anyone to intercede for you, to pray for you. You could pray directly to God. They believed that each church should elect its own elders and make its own decisions, not have decisions handed down to them by some central authority, and so forth. And as a result, they tended to be very forthright in offering their opinions on things. Now, in the South, this honor system, essentially, honor requires an audience. What happens if someone takes away your honor? You're dishonored. You've been dissed. And if that is done publicly and other people know about it, then you are apt not to respond well. Examples of other honor-based cultures. A lot of Hispanic culture, a lot of Middle Eastern culture, and East Asian culture in particular, China and Japan, in which everyone kind of has their place in the social strata, just like they did in the Southern colonies, just like, if you'll admit it, people still do in the South. Don't get above your raisin, as my grandma used to say. So these different groups. By the way, East Asia, strong influence of Confucius. And if you've ever read Confucius, a lot of the things that he said sounds like something my grandma would say, because it's all about how you are supposed to fit in to your community and how you're supposed to respect your elders and not spoke until spoken to and all that stuff, and be respectful toward other people. Because if you are not, you're dishonoring yourself and your household. You bring dishonor on your household. So some similarities I've noticed between East Asian culture and the American South include the fact that in all of those cultures I just mentioned, including Southern culture, there is kind of a prescribed way you're supposed to converse. You have all these niceties that you're supposed to go through. You're not supposed to come directly to the point. That's rude. You're supposed to talk about the weather. You're supposed to ask about the other person's family. You're supposed to find out who their mama's people are and whether you know them. And you go through all that before you get to the actual point of your conversation. If you come forthrightly to the point of the conversation, you are presenting to others the appearance that you don't care about all that stuff, and that you don't care about the social structure, and you have to in these societies, because if not, like I said, you're bringing dishonor upon yourself, and also you are inviting violence. Now here's something that's interesting. Year after year they take these surveys and they find that areas in the South, cities in the South, are the ones that people regard as the most polite in the country. But at the same time, for I would imagine as far back as you can go, the South has the highest rate of violent crime in the country. It still does. Now, why is that? It's because if you don't behave according to the norms expected from you, the implication is you might be punished for it. If you're acting, quote, uppity, we'll talk in a lot more detail about that stuff when we get to the 1850s toward the end of this course. But essentially, bear that in mind and think about that in context of your own experiences. And also be aware, a lot of historians have written about this. Some of them agree with me on this, and some of them don't. But I think if you've had experience living in different parts of the country, you will recognize that the culture in the South is different than other areas. And I argue that goes back all the way to the very establishment of these colonies.